Hi there, I am starting my sewing journey over from square one, and by square I mean rectangles. I'm going to be sewing a Noren, or a door curtain, for my bedroom. Before I get into the details though, huge shout out to Billy Matsunaga on YouTube and her Patreon Discord community, which has been super supportive while I've been learning to sew more Japanese style clothing. Billy also does a ton of lectures that are Patreon exclusive, so I recommend you check out her channel and, if you can, her Patreon, because the lectures she does, not just on how to wear kimono, but also textile art on the weaving, the dyeing, sewing, like all these things that make up Japanese textile art, and I am absolutely fascinated by it. So I wanted to make a Noren for my bedroom because I have sensitivity to light in the middle of the night. If there's a light source, my brain will just focus on it and I cannot sleep. I have to have my door open or my cats will just claw at the bottom of my door until I open the door. I love them. So in order to block light coming in from the hallway, I decided a Noren would be great. To start this project, I bought some linen scrim from fabricdirect.com, which is the type of fabric that you would use for light, airy curtains. So I've actually got the offcut here. The fabric is very see-through. It's a fairly open weave. It unravels quite a lot as you work on it. So the first step you actually do is to square it off, to make it perfectly on grain. So I did a thread pull where I found the narrowest point of the fabric and I pulled out that thread, and then I use that as my cutting edge. So I use a dental tool. You can use a sewing needle, anything to grab a hold of just that one thread. With the benefit of this linen scrim is that the threads are fairly large and the weave is pretty light. And then before cutting, I actually stabilize the threads by using a whip stitch, about 3 or 4 warp threads in, just to keep the warp threads from unraveling as I work with the piece. Then after I have secured that entire edge, then I will actually cut it, and that's just, again, prevents it from unraveling while I'm working on it. To finish off all of the edges, I used a blind hem, which you basically work, it's like a rolled hem, but you're working in between the layers of the fabric of the roll. So big thanks to Bernadette Banner and for V Birchwood. Both have fantastic sewing channels that have covered this technique, but I really wanted to make sure that I didn't have any visible stitching on this, and so that's why I wound up going with the blind hem. So first I secure my thread in, take a bite of maybe about 4 or 5 threads of the bottom side of the rolled hem. So this is the part that when you fold it back is going to be completely in between the roll. And then for the facing material, I will take just a single thread from that stitch, and because of the way that the threads are overwoven, that my thread theoretically will go between the warp and the weft and won't be seen from the front side of the fabric. So that's why I decided to go with a blind hem. Once I've basically done all of that stitching, I also then go ahead and iron it, and I actually did the 2 outside edges. I did the drawn thread 3 times in the middle, once for my cutting edge and twice for my folding edge on that rolled hem. And then with that drawn thread there, it actually folds really easily and crisply along that line. And that's just where you can see here, it's pinned in the middle, so I know where my rolled hem is going to be. So when I draw my design, that it's going to be matching across the center of the two panels. I'm using a Tombow watercolor marker because this will wash out during the dye process. I think actually in my final product this blue color does show through just a little bit because the soda ash actually grabbed some of the water pigments from it, but that's why I'm also using a blue, because my goal is to dye this in an indigo, not actual indigo, but in indigo color-ish. So I'm just drawing that on based off of my sketch that I've got, and you know, I'm not doing anything precise, just going with what looks right for this particular piece. When figuring out which Shibori stitches to do for the design, gotta think about, is this going to be a line? Is this a solid shape? Do I want to have some kind of texture in the fill? So the most basic stitch you can do in any stitching is a running stitch, where you just back and forth throughout the fabric. And in Shibori, when you do that, you get a very nice line. You can follow curves, all kinds of things like that. And then when you draw it tight, that leaves this area that's built up of a little series of dots that basically makes a line. The finer the stitch, the finer the line. That is the basis of almost everything. Then you can do variants based off of that. So you can do a ladder stitch, which is that you do one stitch on the facing fabric, then underneath the fabric you go over and do a stitch over here and a stitch over here. Or you fold the fabric along the middle and then you just do a running stitch. It winds up with the same result, and that is also a common thing. So then instead of the single line, you get two lines. And so I did that for every single blade of grass. Then using the straight stitch is something called the mokume, the wood grain stitch. You basically just pick a direction that is perpendicular to the way you want the grain to go. So like if I want the grain to go sideways, I do vertical stitches. And these are just parallel lines. Now normally you do these with multiple threads, tying a knot for each single one. I find that a bit tedious, so I just decided to do kind of like a zigzag, where I just do one down and then one up, one row down, one row up. It creates basically the same kind of look. So I used wood grain stitch for that. It's great for creating fills. There's another stitch that you can use to create fills, which I didn't use on this project, where you create a running stitch for whatever shape you're doing. Like say I was doing a butterfly. You do the running stitch, and then you gather it up and you pull a point from like here out, and then you just wrap the thread around it. This is probably the closest to Western style tie-dye. Like when I grew up, we used to use beet juice and rubber bands to tie-dye t-shirts. It was just something we did. So that's the closest to that, in that you've got a shape. It doesn't have to be a circular shape. It can be an irregular shape. And when you pull it out and you draw these lines, and then that creates that. And this is the maki-age stitch. I did a variant of that, which I had seen on Pinterest. Someone had done some tie-dye bamboo, and it looked similar to the way that the maki-age looked, but it was also different. And I thought, I'm gonna try doing something, which is that instead of doing a running stitch all the way around, I'm gonna do one first running stitch and draw that tight. And then I am going to use my needle and thread to spiral around the shape, drawing it tight as I go. And that should also create a fill, which is going to be good for like rectangular shapes. I don't know how well it'd work for rounded shapes. I mean, I suppose if you had, again, that same butterfly wing, where you would wrap your thread around here, and you would get more or less filled in. And then there is the nemaki, which is sometimes called like a bead stitch. Basically, you're making little bitty circles, and so you can take like a bead, you can put that in your fabric, and then wrap your thread around the throat of the fabric, and that creates these little circles. I like to just do a running stitch that's a circle around that, draw it tight, and then just wrap my thread around that gathering point. As I get closer to the finalized version of the design, I can start pulling some of these blades of grass into their tight position, and I just wanted to show you how I secure these at the end. Basically, after I've tightened it down as tight as I can get it to pull, I just take a little bit of a back stitch at the end of the design. You can also theoretically just wrap your thread around the shape if it's a small enough shape, but I just find taking this little small back stitch is pretty good. Sometimes just a single back stitch is enough to hold it through the dyeing process. If I feel like it needs the extra reinforcement, then I'll do the second back stitch. For dyeing, I actually just use my bathtub, and I have this tub. I can get it really nice and hot, and so I just fill it up with as much as I need. This time was the first time that I used a soda ash solution, and that is a type of mordant that basically just helps the dyes actually bite into the fabric. And so just giving those pieces a quick soak in that soda ash. I have seen folks like Closet Historian where you can mix the soda ash in directly with your dyes. I am using just RIT all-purpose dyes for natural fibers, since this is linen, and I'm using their indigo to start off with. I'm going to go ahead and mix that in. I'm just using a PVC pipe to stir it because hey. And I've got my sample here that I will test out the color. I'm not testing for darkness here, I'm just looking at the tone of the blue, and I'm noticing that's more saturated than what I want. So as I suspected I would need to do, I am mixing in some of the dark brown. This later actually kinds to bite me in the butt a little bit, because as you'll see in the reveal, the color doesn't come out exactly like I expect. And I think it's a combination of the fact that I didn't machine and detergent wash this linen before doing it in this dye bath, and so the sizing that was on the material in the first place actually reacted with the dye, blocked some of the dye from absorbing into the fabric. So it's a different color than what I was expecting, but that's not a bad thing. I do like it. So you want to give this quite a lot of time to get the dye to soak in. I actually wound up soaking these entirely overnight. Then after it's had a bit of time to drip out, rinse it with cold water until the water basically runs clear, and then hanging to dry, drip dry a little bit, I can finally start taking the stitching out. I had a couple of friends come in to visit and inspect what I was doing during this process. Undoing the stitching, because of the thread that I'm using, which is like a cotton yarn that I've got from Daiso, super cheap, actually works really well for this, but I probably shouldn't have done it in black. It was a little hard to see against this dark indigo gray.
Yeah, what's up?
He's a sweetheart. But this is the exciting part, is getting to take out all of these stitches. This spiral stitch did take a bit more work to undo. Some of the other sections come out really easy, like any of the running stitch areas. Basically, once you pop that knot off and then you cut out the back stitches, it just comes right out. And that's the first time I get to actually see what this is looking like. So working on this in the evenings and weekends after work, I was able to finish my Noren in 2 weeks. It took me considerably longer to do the blind hemming than it did to do the Shibori, which makes sense. I was spending a lot of time making sure that my stitches were small, even, and hidden. Versus Shibori, they're big and even, but they don't have to be like very precise. The thing I like about Shibori is that the design will take on an organic, perfectly imperfect look. So that's one of the reasons why I decided to do it. I do plan on learning some other textile designing. I have done block printing. I've tried to do screen printing. I would love to do brushwork and actual silk painting. I'll get there. This project I could not be happier with. The fabric dye should have been this fantastic indigo, and it still is on this piece. So I'm not sure exactly why on my curtain it's more gray, but I kind of love it. Like, there's this subtle modeling of the color. Part of it, I think, is actually the Tombow marker where I drew out the design. The soda ash grabbed onto those pigments and actually held them onto the fabric rather than letting it wash away, like I was expecting it to do. So it's got like this very subtle light blue everywhere where I did my stitching, and then it goes into this gray, which itself has just very, very subtle, not like ice dye modeling, but just more like watercolor granulation of the brown and the blue pigments, which is great. I love it. I don't think I have much more to say than that. So I don't know how often I'll be putting out videos onto this channel. I do work full-time. I'm a work-at-home artist. which is absolutely fantastic. In the evenings, I like to spend a little bit of time away from my screen, and so that's where learning to sew again from the beginning. Like, I've been sewing since I was 6 years old, but learning the basics over again has been really rewarding. Like, when I made this Noren, I wanted to do something where I'm going to be seeing this every single day, hanging up in my house, and I wanted to be proud of it, and I really am, which is just fantastic. So thank you for joining me on this journey, and I'll see you sometime. Bye.